Welcome to Conveyancing Matters, where this week I will be talking to Ewan Treadgold about the Solicitors Qualifying Examination. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. So, Ewan, mate, how are you?
Very well indeed. Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks for having us on. It's
No,
good to
not
see you.
at all. Yeah, likewise, not at all. It's lovely to see you again, Ewan. So, tell our lovely viewers before we talk about the SQE, the Solicitors Qualifying Examination. Tell our lovely viewers and podcast listeners who you are, what you do, where you do it, and how we know
Yeah.
each other.
So I am solicitor, work in property litigation now, worked for many years in conveyancing sort of practice and qualified originally in Cilex around 2019, sat SQE sort of a little bit later when I shifted practice areas and then moved into qualification as solicitor in 2024. So I've had a sort of strange kind of pathway. And during that time, obviously we worked together.
Yes.
Um, at yeah, a couple of firms. I'm at Tees now at the moment. Tees Law, based in Bishop Stortford. But yeah, I've worked at other firms previously, and we obviously worked together in the past. So yeah, that's my kind of journey, shifting from conveyancing, residential, and sort of some commercial transactional work, and then into property litigation over
Yeah,
the
I have
last
to
2 years.
say, Ewan, we all know, and the people watching and listening to this just know how damn hard residential conveyancing is in terms of just the general sort of transactional and other challenges. And I always thought that it was always, for anybody as a career move, actually a move from resi into property litigation. They were just things that sort of always sat well together. And
Hmm.
frankly, there's always going to be a constant stream of work for you from your resi team, isn't there?
Certainly, and we find it. I mean, Tees have quite a large sort of residential conveyancing offering. Firms have worked at previously, sort of lesser so, and more work was coming in from your commercial teams. But we see sort of the commercial property team and the residential property team here at Tees shifting quite a lot of, or funneling quite a lot of work into property litigation because so much on that transaction. I've always felt this about residential. So much on the transaction has a litigious element to it.
Yeah.
People are assessing risks, and if you're assessing risks, the risk is litigation. That's the risk where it ends up. If you're doing something, if you're taking a punt on something, you're taking a risk. Do you want to know where it ends up? How it might be a problem in the future? Even little things like charging orders cropping up on titles, we'll quite often get involved on those. How can we, is it application to the court? Old bankruptcy notices, again, these things sort of get fed into us. Again, applications to court because the bankruptcy notice has been there since 1997
Yes.
and the court doesn't even know about it. And you're going, can we remove it, please? And they go, well, don't even know what it is. And you go, oh, magic. So I've got to apply again to the
Excellent.
court. Yeah, so we need a court application that's 6 months out of your life because you're not going to the top of the pile. The fact that there's a little notice on your title that you want to buy, even
Yeah.
if it is your dream home, the judge doesn't really care at that point. So,
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I do obviously training and all that. I do sessions on notices to complete, but I'm really always really clear about the line between me as a non-contentious lawyer and the fact that actually if something goes horribly wrong when a matter hasn't completed, well, court's where it's going.
yeah, yeah,
We've got the notice to complete procedure, but what I always try and tell my non-contentious conveyancing colleagues is, look, you might want to serve the notice to complete, but maybe considering specific performance, maybe the fact that it might end up in court, that's not part of your job because you're not a property litigator. And I find that's a real grey area for conveyancing lawyers.
yeah. And thankfully, it doesn't come up a lot. Thankfully, that isn't the one that we're getting. I mean, if we were getting lots of notices to complete into our department, we'd definitely be reassessing some of the procedures in our conveyancing team.
Ah,
You
well,
know,
let me give you a tip,
yeah,
Ewan, because the Law Society at the end of 2023 announced that it was going to change the way we exchanged. Now, of
of
course,
course it
and
was.
then they had a very
Yeah.
short consultation, and it's incredibly complicated what they've suggested. I'm not saying it's not a good idea, but it just doesn't reflect what's happening in practice. Um, And then, of course, last year the Law Society got completely caught up with the property information form debacle, and that rumbles on. So
Yeah.
the whole idea of the way you exchange is changing got sort of shelved. But the serious point, Ewan, is if they do bring it in, and CQS firms will be obliged to use the new exchange protocols. I think there's just going to be a massive bedding in issue. CLC firms won't have to use it. And I think for the first time, probably ever, will have massive challenges around has this matter exchanged, hasn't it, in an area that was never controversial. So look out for it, Ewan, and seriously prepare yourself as a property litigator because I think there will be a lot of misunderstanding
Yeah, and it
when
sounds like there'll be quite a lot of work there suddenly
yes,
for a prop lit department. As I say,
yes,
we don't have a huge amount of notice to complete work, but it absolutely gets funneled to us and sent to us as soon as
yeah,
it's obvious that something's not happened. Just bringing back to your point on the specific performance and assessment of specific performance. Um, Again, you know, judges don't want to see delays in there. So if you've sat around being like, "Oh, it's all right, we'll just extend the contract another 6 months," or I've seen those types of agreements, and then it arrives on your desk and you go, "Hang on," and now you want to go for specific performance. You re-exchanged your contract 6 months ago. The judge isn't going to look particularly helpful, like particularly nicely on your um, on you delaying this.
yes.
If you want specific performance, you get in there quickly. Same with injunctions. These are things that have to go there. As soon as you feel like you want that, you send it to your litigation team and they prepare the application. They get it into the court for you.
And maybe this is a segue we didn't know we had. He who
Hmm.
comes to equity comes with clean hands, Ewan. A
Yeah,
little bit of black letter law there, which maybe seamlessly takes us into the SQE 1 and 2.
absolutely.
Which of course is what we were going to talk about. So, Ewan, as you've said, you have sort of manfully trotted through the SQE 1 and 2, Solicitors Qualifying Examination 1 and 2, just for the benefit of the people watching that don't know. I mean, to qualify as a solicitor, you used to have to get a law degree or a GDL and pass the legal practice course. That's effectively being phased out, and we've got the SRA and CAP Brave New World, been with us, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, I
Yep.
suppose 3 or 4 years. The Solicitors Qualifying Examination, the sort of gateway qualification is SQE1, which is a vast bank of multiple choice questions that candidates have to pass. And if they pass that, then they can go on to the skills element of the SQE2, which is a whole load of skills assessments, interviewing, advocacy, writing, research, case matter analysis, not research,
Hmm.
and research, which isn't really research, is it? That's the point, really. Across a whole bunch of practice areas, so pretty challenging. So Ewan, we spoke a while ago about your SQE journey, and I
Hmm.
think when we first spoke, you were about to embark on the SQE1, the multiple choice element of this qualification, and you did that in January 23, and then you moved
Hmm.
swiftly on to SQE2, the skills element. So
Yes.
I thought, for the benefit of people who were perhaps thinking of doing this or about to embark on it or have got their assessments coming up, you and it, just your experience of the coalface of these qualifications really would be really useful.
Hmm.
So I mean, let's start at the beginning. So it's fair to say the SRA had some fairly significant teething problems, didn't it, at the beginning with regard to its booking process, which I think has improved somewhat. But the bun fight to even get booked on an assessment was pretty challenging, you said.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of it opens at one time at a time that they tell you. So you log in and you're, number however many hundredth in the queue, and it's got a little man that walks along the screen. It's like 7 hours before you can book your exam. So it felt like you were taking half a day just sitting there, whilst you could sit at your computer and do a little bit while you're, likes of me and other people I was working with, we were in practice. We were actually working for law firms. So it wasn't like we could just have Netflix on in the background while we, watch this little man walk across the screen. So there was hours spent doing that. When you did get in there, you didn't always get the exam room you wanted. So, I certainly had friends who were traveling 2 or 3 hours from where they lived in order to get actually get a place where they could sit the exam. For me, I got lucky. I lived near Chelmsford and got a place in Chelmsford for SQE1, SQE2 less less lucky. Ended up at the tobacco dock, I think it was down in London. But again, I live in Essex. It's a train ride in. It's easy enough for me. But I know there were some people who couldn't even get to somewhere near them, and you're having to travel 2, 3 hours on the day of one of the biggest exams of your lives. Yeah, being a Cilex qualified lawyer, I was generally a bit more relaxed about it, I think, than others. For other people, these things are going to be massive for them. But
Yeah,
I still had a practicing certificate, so I was like, if I fail, I can still practice.
yeah,
So it wasn't.
exactly. Oh,
It
well,
was
and I
a
also think, and this sounds patronizing, and I don't mean it to, but
no.
um, as you say, it's a very big deal for people who are probably a bit younger than you with
Mm,
less sort of experience. Lots of people I know have felt that, the need to then incur the cost of staying the night before
yeah.
near to wherever they're, which frankly, given the unreliability of the trains sometimes is no bad thing. But and it's fair to say that as far as I'm aware, I mean, I I've worked with a couple of SQE providers and continue to do so with one of them. As the SRA and Kaplan, the SRA in particular, has sort of improved its booking process. I don't think it's completely streamlined yet, but I think an important point for people who are thinking of doing this to realise is that they do need to get their sort of SRA ducks in a row first, in that they need to have gone through a registration process
Yes.
with the SRA and done all of that before they book on the assessments, and they do need to sort of actively keep an eye out for the SRA booking windows when
Hmm.
those windows open. And you sort of, I think effectively now you sort of get a sort of an online sort of ticket to in terms of booking. So I don't, they are, to be fair to them, trying to streamline it, but it's still a pretty stressful process. And I think a really important point for people, and I'm saying this simply because I've seen it with quite a lot of students.
Mm.
There are, of course, now a number of SQE training providers, but what I think students need to realise is that there is no connection whatsoever between any of the training providers and the SRA and Kaplan. The SRA doesn't endorse any training providers, and your training provider is completely separate. So it's the student's responsibility to book with the SRA to do the registration. And of course, if a student needs reasonable adjustments and they've made an application to their training provider for reasonable adjustments for the training provider's assessments, the students need to understand that they need to make a separate application using the different forms and a different procedure to the SRA if they
Mm.
need any reasonable adjustments in the Kaplan exam. So I do think it's important for students to realize that there's a lot of clear blue water between the two. But I mean, not without mentioning names, Ewan, what would you say if someone's looking for an SQE training provider? What are some of the tips you would give somebody to be thinking about when they're thinking of who do I book with?
Yeah. So I mean, I always think that you want big banks of practice questions, and I'm sure all providers have got them. The ones I used had loads of them, and that for me was the best part of my revision. Don't get me wrong, I did the sort of reading the textbooks and actually looking through it, doing your notes and all those types of things. But the really important thing is being able to answer those questions, being able to do them, that discipline of that 90 seconds. I think that's what you've got. You've got 180 questions and for whatever hours. I think it calculates to about sort of 90 odd seconds per
Yeah,
question from memory, sort of in SQE1. You've got to be able to answer those questions and you've got to be able to think quickly. Um, that I think is great for a training provider. What no training provider teaches you is the sort of resilience part. And this is something that I only found out really after the exam. When you are sitting there having answered 10 questions in a row and you have no idea if any of them were right, and it happens because you can't know all of this stuff, um, have you got the like resilience to just carry on and go and clear your head and go, okay, well, that's 10 done. I've got to move on and I've got to really focus on the next 10 that are coming through and the next 10. And it is relentless, the SQE1, that it is just question after question, and there are ones that you will not know, and how do you bounce back from it? And there's no, I was used to writing essays at university. So when you don't know in an essay, perhaps you can maybe just do a little bit of writing, a bit of flowery language, and you might be able to blag it, and enough to give the examiner this idea that you know where
Yeah.
you're going with it. That's how we're often taught at university. None of that. There is one answer. It is correct. And if you don't hit it, you don't get the point for it.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's a really important point. I mean, the students I look after, you and I always tell them actually, well, frankly, SQE1 and SQE2,
mm,
it's a marathon, not a sprint. And actually, I've often said to people, and you're absolutely bang on here, it is actually the mental challenge. It is to just have the strength of mind, and this is very hard, um, to accept that you're not going to know it all.
yeah,
However good a student you are not going to know it all. And for both SQE1 and SQE2, I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever give students is to say to them, look, come to terms with that fact and have a strategy for dealing with the fact that you're not going to know everything.
yeah,
And so, for example, in SQE1, and every training provider, they offer a lot of support to their students. And they will offer strategies. So whether when you don't know a question and you always pick answer A, or whether if you haven't got a clue, you pick the longest answer,
yeah,
whatever it is you do, but having that strength of mind, crucially, as you said, to take your minute and 40 seconds, your 90 seconds or whatever it is, um, and move on. If you
yeah.
don't know, don't cry, don't panic, don't waste 10 minutes trying to work out that one question,
No,
because that is just going to knacker you for the rest of the
yeah,
assessment, and
you,
you're not going to finish it. And of course, in that last block of 10, there might be questions that you could easily do.
yeah.
So actually answer every question, get to the end. If in doubt, move on. I think, are some of the key bits of advice I've given students.
Yeah, and in the exam itself, there is like a I imagine it's still the same now, and certainly seems to be from colleagues of mine who have sat it within the last sort of 6 months or so. There is the ability to flag it. So what I did find in the exam was I was like, I, I would flag the ones where I've put the answer that I don't know. I've just gone, I don't know the answer. I'm putting that because that's my 90 seconds up. If I get the chance to amend it, I'll come back and amend it. So I was very disciplined on my timing, sort of sitting there in the exam, and I found that was quite helpful. It usually meant that I got to the end and I had a few minutes that I could just look again at a handful of questions, perhaps where I was uncertain, and I was only flagging the ones where I was absolutely like don't know the answer, not the ones where quite often your first answer is your best answer. I've found certainly with my practice questions. So if I thought I knew the answer, I didn't flag the question, even if I was slightly uncertain. I was like, no, I've gone for that. And you are often sitting there on a 50-50 split on two answers, and you just have to go with one because if you don't know it but you've boiled it down to two of the five that are available, just stick to your answer. That's what I found, and that seemed to work for me. It
Yeah,
might
I
not
think
work for everyone, but
I think it's a really good piece of advice, you. And I mean, I always say, trust your instinct. You're more likely to be right nearer the beginning of the exam than near the end.
yeah,
So if you've got, you're not sure, but I think I'm okay. Trust your instinct. Don't change that first answer unless it's really glaringly, evidently wrong on review.
yeah.
Um, yeah, as you say, stick with what you first put. I think that's a really good piece of advice.
Hmm.
So we'll talk about SQE2 in a second, Ewan, but are there any other particular sort of nuggets or comments or advice you would want to give anyone specifically regarding SQE1? Because I think at the end of the day, initially everybody thought, and I think whether we think it's a good gateway exam or not is really irrelevant because we've got it now. I've got my views on it, but that's
Hmm.
irrelevant too. Um, but I think what people need to understand is that those multiple choices, it's a massively different discipline in terms of
Yeah,
being assessed, isn't it? Particularly as a lot of them are the best of. It's not just a clear right answer and four wrong ones. You could
no,
have five right answers and one is just a better answer. And I
yeah. So
think
they
that's
ca-
a
they call
challenge
it
for people.
exactly this, don't they? They call it the single best answer. I think
Mm.
everyone sort of certainly when I was studying it, maybe they've changed it now, but when I studied it, it was called the single best answer questions. For exactly that reason, you can be sitting there staring at five questions and you go, they're all correct. and then you've got to figure out which one is more correct than the others.
Yeah.
And and it is this. It's going to be quite a different discipline from the if you've come out of LLB law degrees and you or QLD law degrees and you're now into SQE, you're going to be going, this is wholly different. And it's wholly different. You're never doing it in practice either. That's the other problem I've sort
Yeah.
of got with the single best answer stuff. It's like you're not presented with five correct answers by your supervisor who then says, which one's more correct of these five?
Yeah.
And you go, "Well, that just doesn't happen. And when we talk about SQE2 in a minute, I'll say how I think that's a little bit more relevant or a bit better than the single best answer stuff. But I'd say I don't mind the single best answer questions. I think it's quite American, it's quite LSAT sort of approach, I think, um, to it. But you got to find a way to churn through all of this in a centralized and standardized way. You couldn't have however many 4,000 candidates being marked every 3 months by solicitors.
Yeah.
There probably isn't the thing for it in a centralized way in the same way, not without increasing various costs, fees, and everything else that needs to be done. So I can see why they've done it. Any provider that you choose, I think, or the ones that I've used two different providers, one for SQE1 and one for SQE2. They were both really good at kind of preparing you, I think, for those exams. And I've not really heard colleagues of mine have used various different
Mm.
providers in the past, and I've not really heard much. No one said any one of them is terrible. Everyone's a little bit disgruntled with them because they're teaching a course that none of them have prepared. Whereas with the LPC, at least you were being taught the course that they were then writing the exams for.
Yeah.
Now they're all preparing you for an exam. None of them have sat. I think that's always going to be the problem you're going to have. It'll always feel a little bit disjointed. I think, and you'll never quite feel fully engaged. Often you're working at the same time as doing it. So
Yeah,
it's not
that's a
like,
massive challenge. And actually, I think people need to realise that the SRA and Kaplan, obviously on the MCQs, they've got a fair bank of sample MCQs on their website now, which obviously the providers point their students to. But there's no meaningful interaction between the SRA and Kaplan and any of the training providers. So the SRA and Kaplan are never giving the training providers any sort of inside track. So the training providers are very much saying, well, we'll base this on the exemplars that the SRA has put up. I mean, I've written, probably thousands of MCQs now.
yeah.
I wouldn't care if I never saw one, but you kind of hope that you're in the SRA's groove, and most of the time you are. But
Yeah.
I think people do need to understand that there's no real sort of sharing of information or strategy or approach by the SRA and Kaplan. The training providers are doing what, as you've sort of alluded to, really what they think's best. So what would you say then, Ewan, just before we move on to SQE2, what would you say is perhaps the main piece of advice you would give anyone approaching SQE1?
It's going to be the cliched ones, isn't it? You've got to be committed to this. This is not an easy exam. You are unlikely to be able to pass through this exam unless you're some sort of savant or absolute genius, and in which case, fair play, go and sit the exam tomorrow. You're unlikely to do it unless you really put the hours in. And I am by no means great with my studying. I've always been a rush before the exam sort of person, and I was lucky enough to get sort of the 6 weeks off before the exam, and that's when I pretty much just hammered out everything and managed to do it. So for me, that can be done if you can get a lot big block of time off before. Most firms won't be giving you that, so you will be in practice. You will have to set aside those hours each week, and you will have to be disciplined. And my younger colleagues who have sat the exam just in January were far more disciplined at this. They weren't having big blocks of time off before the
Yeah,
exam. And they were coming out feeling relatively confident about it. And that's because their weekends were spent doing it. Their evenings were spent doing it. They really put in that time, put in those hours. There is so much to learn that you need that time. You need to be able to set it aside and work at the same time. Often you're doing your 5 days a week or 4 days a week, and then you're studying as well. The other one, that's what I think. I think you've got to really be committed for this stuff, and you've got to really step up um, and find the time to do it. That I think is the key for me. That's the key point. And then other things are just, yeah, remember you're working. Remember that the timing is really difficult for it, and it is hard, and you're not going to know it all. I think that's,
Yeah.
back to your point again. Are you really going to be able to put in the really obscure part of CPR Part 36 into your mind for every single for the exam? Is it that paragraph in the textbook that they're going to ask the obscure point, or are you going to be able to memorize that as well as the whole rest of the textbook? Well, no, you're not. So you just have to stuff you can't get. You just move on. I remember in my I'm awful on doing tax, so I just dismissed tax near enough and rode my luck a bit and got away with it in my exam. There wasn't as many tax questions as I thought there was going to be. So so yeah, there is a element of just move, like we said before with the moving on while you're in the exam. Sometimes you've got to move on with your studying as well. Just go, I'm not getting
Well,
that part, move on to
that's
the next
true.
part.
I often find myself saying to students, look, don't spend the entire weekend on this one esoteric point. I
Mm.
also say to people, whether SQE1 or 2, actually, look, if you're struggling with something and you're in a you're down a real rabbit hole and you feel yourself getting stressed, actually get the SRA syllabus up on the screen. It's huge. And then look for the one line in that syllabus that you're
Yeah,
not understanding. Give yourself a sense of perspective. Stand back and say, God, I'm really struggling with, planning.
yeah,
Actually stand back and look, and how big is that one topic that you're struggling with in the 500 lines of syllabus that you've got to know in terms of content. And I do actually think sometimes just reminding students to have a little bit of perspective can be quite a good thing. But
yeah.
well, moving on to SQE2, Ewan. So this is the skills element of the exam. You've got to get SQE1 passed and under your belt, and of course there aren't an indefinite number of goes at that. So
Mhm.
I suppose another piece of advice I would give is make sure you're well prepared. If you're in doubt, book on the next sitting. But um, because you don't have an indefinite number of attempts at
Yeah,
it. But the SQE2 is very much about the skills, and as I've said, it's interviewing, advocacy, research, case and matter analysis, and legal writing, basically across all the practice areas. And I suppose the first thing to say, Ewan, is you don't have new content to learn, because the content, the law and practice that you learnt for SQE1 is the law and practice that's being put into practice in SQE2. So
yeah.
did that help you at all? I mean, you did yours quite close together, but did you find that a help?
Yeah, I think it is good. If you can do them close together, great. And there were people I spoke to who sat that January exam because when I did it, and they may have changed the timings, but what you could do is you could sit the January exam, get your results in March. The exam window for SQE2 had then opened a couple of weeks before your results for SQE1 came out, and you could book yourself in for the April SQE2 exam if there were spaces. And some people I spoke to were doing that. That for me feels a little too close. So I went with yeah, sort of got my results in the March, sat my exam in the July, and I think that really helps. I mean, just picking up on your point about um, you've already learned the content. In fact, you've learned more than what you need for SQE2 because the constitutional and EU stuff doesn't come up, or the retained EU law and the constitutional provisions. They don't come up in SQE2, and there's some other elements I think that don't come up in the SQE2 exam, but you've learned for SQE1.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
you need to. I think the thing is probably with your legal services in your conduct, you have to
mm,
remember that they're pervasive.
yeah,
Conduct's always a pervasive. And what I always remind people on the SQE2, um, it can't be a triumph of bullshit over content.
no,
Really, and I've seen this with students for years, and some of the nicest students I remember have been incredibly gregarious, lovely, lovely people who just thought they could sort of rock on, same on the LPC, rock up on the
mm,
skills assessment, be a bit charming, be a bit gorgeous, but absolutely know nothing, and then
no,
be a bit surprised when they failed. And because you've got to, again, you've got to have that sort of law and practice foundation, you and haven't you to pass.
yeah. A key thing I think for SQE2 has always been structure, structure, structure. Like if everything looks correct. Remember this one, the first one's marked by a computer, SQE1 near enough as far as I'm concerned, and then is like looked at by someone else. Um, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but there's a reason they're doing it in that standardized sort of way so this stuff can be automated. SQE2 is still marked by a person and is still marked by an individual. So you've got to be structured. If they look at something that's structured and logical, if you're a little bit off on the law, I think you're going to get a better reward for that. I think people are human nature eventually kicks in, or human behavior eventually kicks in when
Yeah.
someone's marking something. Um,
I mean, would
so
you agree with me, Ewan? And I ask you this because some supervisors I teach with don't, but I have
mm,
to say my advice to students in relation to SQE2 quite often is less is more
mhm,
in the sense that, and also I've got so many cliches here, but if in doubt, leave it out.
yeah,
If you don't think you know something, put what you do know, deal with what you can deal with well.
mhm.
Don't convince the assessor you don't know what you're doing by going that extra mile and putting that extra stuff in that's nonsense. So I'm very much, pare it back, do what you can do well, even if, as you've just said, it's not quite as much as you might want to do.
Yeah, I don't think that's a terrible mantra for practice, I've got to say as well. Like you wouldn't think of the person who's marking this. We are thinking about practice. I think there is an underlying thing for SQB2, and that the SRA has got all sorts of problems, but there is an element of this, I think, where they've thought we've got to focus it around practice and got to be realistic for practice. If you don't know something in practice, you don't just go, oh, I'll just blag my way through that. That's not how it works. You outline, you put in what you do know and what you can come to a conclusion about. I think recognizing where perhaps, yeah, you don't know the knowledge is good. I wouldn't do that in an exam. I would just, like you say, leave it out. I think is often the way. Less is more. Very much a if you looked at the like the questions on the SRA website, the answers that have been done on the SRA website, you can see some of the higher marked ones. Sort of certainly when I was seeing it, some of the ones with the higher marks were shorter than the ones that got less marks and were longer. So I'm very much in your sort of camp on that. I've got to say, Lorraine, it's uh, yeah, put down what you can, just and always focus back on what you're being asked to do. Are you being asked to write to your supervisor, supervising partner? Are you being asked to write to a client? Don't go around, with complex language in your letter to the client. Use that for your supervisor. They're going to understand that. They're going to get that straight away. Defined terms, fine for your sort of supervising partner. Consider it a little bit less for your client and think about the type of client that you're writing to.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, that's a really important point, Ewan. And I mean, basically, I mean, obviously, there are some sort of advocacy and client interviewing slightly different. But basically, what I say to people in terms of the assessment criteria, they need to keep the assessment criteria in mind because basically we've got the 5 C's. In terms of skills, you've got client focus and
Mhm,
clear, precise, acceptable language. And of course, those two are linked because if you're using clear, precise, acceptable language, which to pick up your point means defining the terms, explaining complex terms,
mhm,
then by definition, you're focusing on the client. So those two hang together. So in terms of the skills of my 5 C's, you've got client focus and clear, precise, acceptable language. Then on the law criteria, you've got law content,
mhm,
law comprehensive and conduct and ethics. And whilst conduct and ethics won't come up in every question, I always advise people to stop and think, is there a conduct issue here?
yeah,
Always stop and think about it. And then, of course, layered on top of those 5, you've got your what I call the sort of differentiator criteria. So, have you used relevant sources for research? Have you used relevant facts for case and matter analysis and so on? But those
mhm,
5, I think, are absolutely core. It's remembering what the assessors are looking for. And it comes back to your point that if you've got a beginning, middle, and end, if you've done an introduction, if you've answered those questions in a structured way and done a conclusion, well, as you say, Ewan, if you haven't covered every legal point, well, you're not going to score as highly on law content and perhaps law comprehensive,
mhm.
but you're still going to probably score pretty well on the skills. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. And I think SQE1 you are purely there, law and practice. That's what it's testing you on. Once you're into SQE2, you're into skills. You're suddenly getting half your marks for your skills. My exam, it felt much more weighted towards the skills bit, just a feeling, not I'm not saying I really know, but I scored quite well, even though I didn't really feel like I had a particularly great grasp on some of the law that came up. I
Mm.
got lucky on a few sort of subjects, but there were certainly legal areas there that I didn't know about. And then I looked back at my results and went, oh, I did all right there. And, they really bumped up the skills mark. And the law that I did put in was clearly right as well. I was getting credit for that as well. So it is a, yeah, it is a difficult sort of exam, but I think really focusing on those skill parts of it, that's really important. It's that structure. Advocacy and interview, it all feels quite contrived. Of course it does, because you're walking into a room with one examiner sitting there. It's not like you're standing in a courtroom. You've got to pretend it's one.
Well, it's
And
also, I mean, I feel the legal research is very contrived.
yeah,
I mean, they obviously learnt from the QLTS and the QLTT, the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Test.
mm,
They realised that actually that, it wasn't possible to get people to do independent research. So actually the research is very ring fenced. It's just, well, here's a load of documents, you choose what's relevant. So it's not sort of real research, if you like. So people can perhaps feel a bit more relaxed about that. But what I do think is
mm,
really important for students to focus on is the timing, and
yeah,
making sure you get that piece of work done in the time available. And I think this is something that I see a lot of students not taking. They're not getting their money's worth from their training provider,
mhm,
because again, the training providers are out there, and on the SQE2, all of them, Ewan, in their various different ways, will be offering students the ability to practice those skills,
yeah,
to get tutor input, to do an interview in front of a supervisor, to do advocacy in front of a supervisor, and so on. And I find bizarrely, Ewan, lots of students not turning up to that. And I think that's where the value is for students. Do
mm.
you agree?
Yeah. I have to say I would turn up to that over I would have any of the other classes. The um the provider I used, you got to do one interview, one advocacy. Um, I think it was two or three questions. So you got to do one of each, one of the research, one of the case and matter analysis. The other one escapes me now. Um, it's like
Legal
letter to
writing.
legal writing. Thank you. Um, so you got to do one of each of those, and you got marks back, you got feedback on each of those. Um, Madness not to turn up. I mean, mine was on Teams or Zoom or one of those, because the whole course was online, but it still gave you the preparation and the writing part as well. Like each of them, there were points that the teachers picked up and said, look, just try this. You're near enough there with some of this, having practiced for so long, they could sort of tell. But there are things that you're doing that won't bode well in the exam, and they were spot on.
Mm.
I think with those points. So really important to do that. If you never turned up to any lessons, but they're offering you the opportunity to have exam questions marked and advocacy and interview skills marked, take those points. Just if you didn't do anything else from your course apart from that, at least you know where you sit for the day on the exam. You
Yeah,
know,
turn up.
so
You don't want the first time you do an interview to be with the Kaplan assessor.
yeah.
And I think I'm just shocked that students don't take that massive piece of value out of their courses. And it is challenging. I mean, students, the most of the providers now, they'll have a calendar across the year, or
Mhm,
the length of your course. You're going to know if when those sessions are scheduled. Some employers aren't particularly supportive, if at all, which again is quite shocking.
mhm,
But and I would advise students, if you happen to work with, an unsupportive employer, it's worth taking a half day. You've
yeah.
got the whole year's calendar or the whole course calendar. You know when those practice and feedback sessions are going to be. You know when you're going to get that time, with that supervisor or that tutor. For goodness sake, book that time. Take it if you possibly can. I would say, in terms of input and individual feedback on your particular performance, which means then you get feedback on your particular weaknesses, because everybody's different. And you can watch all of the practice ones, you can watch all of the videos that are out there, but until you actually have a go at it, you're not going to realize the things that you're not so good at.
Yeah. And do not get tricked into thinking because you've worked in practice for 5, 10, however many years, that you can just smash it out on the day. Like, no way can you, because going back to our point about the whole thing is quite contrived. Large parts of it do feel very contrived, um, and because of that, like all exams, you need to be prepped for it in some way. You need to have sort of really thought about where your weaknesses are, and just thinking I smash out attendance notes every day at work, and I write advice to clients all the time. Doesn't matter. Look at
Such
the
a brilliant
SRA
point.
return. Yeah, look at the
Yes.
SRA model answers. What do they look like? Because if yours look like that, you're going to do better than if they look like in practice. Because you know what? Sometimes in practice, your quick reply might work for a particular client, but that is not what the SRA always want to see.
Yeah, that is such a brilliant point, actually. Some of the more challenging people I've worked with are, frankly, the sort of older people that one of the first people I sort of dealt with on this sort of course was a lovely guy, actually. He was and he'd done international arbitration, Ewan, for
Mm,
years, and he enrolled on the CAP exams, probably one of the first iterations of the
mm.
SQE, with no training course. And like exactly as you say, he said, I've interviewed for years and thought he was going to smash it out the park. And of course he didn't. And he appealed to Kaplan and when he turned up to the first and then he enrolled on a course. And when he turned up to the first session with me, he was so angry and sort of felt so hard done by. And I said to him, look, you've got to park all that. If you don't park that bubbling cauldron of resentment, I'm never going to get you through this assessment. Um, I'm helping you to get through this assessment. And part of that, and again, it comes back to the assessment criteria. However good you are at the stuff you do every day, this is what the assessors are looking for. This is what gives the an element of objectivity to the process because they're looking for the same thing from everybody.
Yeah,
And he just hadn't got that first time round. And of course he did subsequently pass, and of course he was subsequently very grateful, and of course he was very nice on social media and said nice things about me on LinkedIn,
yeah,
all of which was lovely. But he actually sticks in the mind, you, and as being exactly the person you've just described.
yeah.
Somebody that had done it for years, and to quote you, as I say, thought he could smash it out the park, and he couldn't.
No, and and that's not because these people are, you know, bad at their job or anything like that. And it is because it is different. It's focused, as you say, on this strange sort of like almost punching a solicitor out in a mold. And we know that doesn't work because there are certain solicitors in this firm that you'll go to for very specific things and for other things. And there's like that one I'll put in front of that client, but I'm not putting him anywhere
Yeah.
near that client. It's those type of scenarios. But the SRA seem to think that every solicitor just, comes out the conveyor belt and just go, yep, they're all identical. But that's why, for me, the exam feels quite contrived in some ways because it is an attempt to standardize something that is rarely standard.
But then again,
It's
it,
quite
it has
different.
to be standardized for the
Of
sort of
course.
fairness and the marking and so on and
Yeah,
so forth. You've got to mark everyone against the same criteria. So, well, yeah,
absolutely.
we could talk about this for days, but in terms of SQE2, because your insights are so brilliant for people about to sort of embark on this or take their assessments. So, what then, perhaps to conclude, Ewan, would be your some of your top tips then around, particularly in relation to SQE2, the skills element.
Yeah, I'd focus on your skills, attend those interviews and those mock things that you get from your provider. Absolutely do that. Read the answers that are on the SRA website and start thinking about how they've been structured. When you're in there, it's structure, 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 as far as I'm concerned. It's being able to sit at that desk and you just go, here's what I'm writing out now. Here's what I'm writing out now. Um, you are at the desk for 3 days, 4 hours at this desk writing. You know, back to resilience again, being able to just sort of pick up and carry on. You're not going to know anything, but at least on this occasion, SQE2 as opposed to SQE1, you do get the chance to write out a little bit more. Um,
I mean, actually, on
so
the don't know point, it's for me, it's all about coping strategies. So you're not going to know the answer to every question on every piece of written work. The key thing, and you're not going to know every question that perhaps you're asked on an interview. So for me, given that you're being assessed against, well, what would a day one solicitor do? To hark back to the point you made, Ewan, um, you're not going to know it all. Make sure you address it. A day one solicitor would go and look something up. So don't ignore the question you can't answer, but just address it in the sense of either in the written form or the verb or orally, just say, this is an interesting or important point. Thank you for raising it. I'll research it and come back to you.
Yep.
That's what a day one solicitor would do. So you're
Yep.
not panicking, you're not crying, you're not being unprofessional, you're not ignoring it, you're not being negligent, crucially, by
Yeah.
talking a load of old cobblers and hoping for the best. You're addressing the fact that you've been asked something you can't answer. You'll go away and look it up. Nobody can ask any more. Now, of course, you're not going to get full marks for legal content, legal comprehensive, because there's something you've not answered. But that hasn't detracted from everything else. And if there's only one element in a question that you deal with in that way, or in an assessment you deal with that way, well, if everything else is okay, you may well pass.
Yeah.
So it's having that. I think it's having that strategy for dealing with the things you don't know, which
Yeah.
there will invariably be.
Which,
Um,
again, back to not a bad thing for practice either. Having a strategy for dealing with the things you don't know, because that crops up. Unfortunately, yeah, we wish it didn't. But sometimes you do sit there and go, I will have to look at that.
yeah.
That is not something I know off the top of my head, because we don't know it all off the top of our heads,
No,
and
no,
and
and
day
I've
one
been
solicitors certainly don't.
yeah, well, and frankly, day a million solicitors like me certainly don't you. And I'm asked
Yeah.
something every week I can't answer, but I think if we get you as old as long as the tooth in the tooth as me, you just kind of I don't know, but don't worry, I'll sort it out.
Yeah, yeah,
But
I'll find it for you.
it's been just marvelous, actually. It's really lovely to see you again, apart from anything else. And thank you for sharing your insights. I'm sure that that's going to be really, really helpful for lots of students taking the SQE1 and SQE2. So I'd really like to thank you for taking the time out of your day. And if anybody's got any questions, they can always direct them to me at Conveyancing Matters, Lorraine at convmatters.co.uk. Can always email me and we can always have a follow-up session, you, and if
Yeah, of
anybody's
course.
got anything in particular they'd like to raise, because
Yeah,
just as I say, lovely to see you and really
and you.
fantastic insights. So thanks for that, Ewan. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Lorraine. No, really lovely to be here. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.